All right, it's good to see everyone here this morning. We had some worksheets. We're getting some of those passed out. If you didn't grab one of those, you can grab one of those. Just kind of a basic worksheet this morning. We're going to do some fill in the blank on those as we go along. And that'll be on some of the different bullet points that we'll have throughout the lesson this morning. So what we'll be looking at this morning is one that is a topic Roger's been teaching about parenting in the morning auditorium classes over the past several weeks. So we're going to take that a step further with not just parenting young children or teenagers, but parenting young adults or parenting adult children in general. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And the more that I got to working on the lesson over the past week or so, the more I got to realizing how complicated it is being a parent of an adult child. And so we'll be thinking about that a lot this morning. Now, my adult children aren't quite as old probably as some of yours are when you think about that. So my experience with that may be a little more limited than what yours may be, but it's still a lot of different principles and examples from the scriptures that we can find that can help walk us through those things and help guide us a little bit as we go along throughout our lives. So we'll be talking about a lot of that this morning. This could be a class of that we could do for a whole quarter. There's so much that can be talked about and discussed when you think about that of parenting adult children. There's so many different facets that go into it. It can be a very complicated season in our lives. We've talked about seasons all year, and being in this position is one that can be very complicated in so many different ways. And we're going to talk about that a lot this morning when we think about that. So as we kind of get started with our introduction this morning, we'll get to the worksheet in just a few moments. The worksheet, I've got just a lot of extra space on there for you to take some notes. We're going to go pretty quickly this morning. I've got a lot of things I would like to cover, so we may not read a lot of verses, but I'll mention a lot of scriptures if you want to jot them down, and then you can read them in your own time, and you kind of go back through and kind of give more thought to what we've discussed this morning. So as we think about that, one of the first scriptures before we get to the worksheet part that I want us to think about is Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 20. And we will read that. So if somebody could read over to Ezekiel chapter 18 and read verse 20 for us, just to kind of get us started this morning. Whoever has it first. Ezekiel 18:20. Okay, thank you. So when you hear that verse, what are some things that come to mind with that when you think about that verse? Okay, all right, individual accountability. So our kids are not going to be responsible for what we do, and vice versa when it comes down to the judgment and things like that. For any sins that we may commit, it's not going to affect them from a judgment standpoint, and vice versa there. But we still have so much responsibility both ways when we think about it on how we carry ourselves and how we present ourselves before our children there. So that's one verse. And then another one that comes to mind is Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. And it's just a few words here. It says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And when you think about that, it may not be that, when you think about that verse, it may not just be, for this class anyway, someone leaving the home to get married. They may just be moving out, maybe moving on to the next chapter in their lives, whether it be to get an apartment or to go to college or whatever the case may be. A man shall leave his father and mother. And then, when we think about in context of our class today, beginning a life of their own there. So when we think about that and think about that verse, we start to think about the independence of our adult children in that way. And sometimes it's hard for us to kind of picture that they can be really that independent. We've raised them since they were a baby. We've seen some of the mistakes they've made as they've come, grown along throughout the years. And then the thought of them going out on their own and beginning a life on their own, it's scary for us. They may be excited, but on the inside, we may be really nervous about that. And that's a big part of raising adult children, is that letting go. And that's something that we'll also be looking at with this. But also, let's look over to Luke chapter 2, verse 49. We're going to see an example of Jesus here. So, Luke chapter 2, verse 49, if someone can read that verse for us. Okay, so Jesus is saying these words. Who was looking for him in that verse? His parents were, right? What was Jesus doing? He had gotten separated from his parents, and what was he doing while they were looking for him? Okay, all right, yeah, he was in the temple. So he was doing spiritual things even at a young age there when we think about the life of Jesus. And we don't get a lot of detail about his younger years, but we see here that he was putting something before his parents. His parents had left. Where were they going? They were going home. So they were leaving Jerusalem there, and everybody was on the road back home, and they were missing Jesus. And he had responsibilities to be with them, but he put God first as he went to the temple to study more and learn more, and really they were learning from him in that situation anyway. But he said, "Why were you seeking me? I was doing my Father's business of teaching and learning more about the Lord." Proverbs 22 verse 6 says, "Train up a child in the way that we should go, or in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." And that's a common verse that we think about often, but it's one that's very important when we think about that of the training starting early. How early should we start training children to think about God? Yeah, from the beginning, from the get-go on that. Training starts early, and trust happens later when you think about that. The more we can train our young people, the more that we can start to trust them at an earlier age. We start to see that they kind of prove themselves when they're in their kids, and then when they're teenagers, and they start to do things. It makes that transition a little easier when they leave the home, because you can kind of start to see that they can be independent and live a life on their own there. All right, so as we kind of get to the main part of our lesson here and to the worksheet, we're going to go through 12 different tips with the worksheet there of things that we should consider, and you can kind of fill in the blanks as we go along. And as we kind of go through this, I may use the phrase kids or children, but I mean adult children. It's even Sadie, she's getting up there in years now. She's still my child, and I still refer to her as that. But so if I say children, I'm meaning adult children in that way as we kind of go through it. But as we think about being parents of adult children, we may have children that are 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years old when we think about it. But we still have responsibilities, but it's just changing. Our responsibilities change as the kids get older, even if they are 60 years old and we're in our 80s or whatever, we still have responsibilities to do certain things. And one of those is in number one with our first one here. So number one, we've got set a great and clear example, and then to avoid hypocrisy. When we think about that, even in our older years, we still have the responsibility of setting the right example for our adult children there. So, as children mature, they see what we are doing as we think about what example that we set for them. Sometimes they want to even test the examples that we are setting for them. If we have maybe a child that's considering leaving the church or leaving the Lord. Sometimes they start to look for, kind of cracks in our character to kind of see some hypocrisy to give them a reason or an excuse to leave. So we have to kind of be careful about that and be sure that, that we are consistent in our example and we set a clear example for them. What's some ways that we can do that? What's some ways that we can set a good, clear example for our children, whether they're teenagers or adults? What's some good ways we can do that? Say it one more time. Okay, come to worship. That's an important one. If we are raising our teenagers and our young adults and with the consistency of being at services, whenever the doors are open, we can expect our children to want to do the same. But if we come, once a week or just on the bigger holidays and things like that, our kids probably aren't going to see the importance as much as being here and the importance of being here to serve the Lord. So it's hard for us to try to guide them in a way that says, hey, you should be at services if we're not even here. So that's one example. Are there any others? How else can we set a good example? Okay, all right. Yep, okay, good. Roger?
Our character outside the building, we see us dealing, buying things, selling things, our attitudes.
Okay. Yeah, so we think a lot of times with our kids, our guards are let down a little more, right? If we're talking to some friends or some people at church, we're a little more on point, I guess, with what we need to be. But our kids see us when our guards are let down. They see us when we're most comfortable. And if at our most comfortable points, if we're not honest with others, or if we're not dealing with others in a honest or even respectful way, they're going to see that. They're going to see those things that can come along there. Yeah, Robin.
Example on how you treat your spouse in everyday life also.
Okay.
And to be totally, young adult, be honest with them, with family life, things that may be happening, and not hide with them.
Yeah. Okay.
Be upfront with them on any things going on in your family.
Okay.
An example in your Bible, read the Bible and that was, for me, that was a huge step in my life. Bedroom, and in his 90s, still in his Bible, reading.
Okay. Yeah, very good. So the kids and adult children are going to see what is most important in your life when you're, doing these type of things. And when we think about setting that right example, those are important things to keep in mind there. So number 2, if you want to fill in the blanks there, always choose God over people and family. And when we think about, when you think about that phrase, what does that tell you, or what does that kind of make you think of? Always choose God over people and family.
I think a lot of times, Nathan, you have family come in from out of state or whatever to visit with you, and then maybe they're not Christians. And when your kids will see you, your emphasis is going to come towards the services. You say, I'm not going to stay home just to be with family.
Right. Yeah.
They're here.
Okay.
I appreciate them being here, but my priorities are.
Yeah, exactly. So and your kids will see that, and the visitors would see that as well. And you can always invite them to come with you, to services. What else with that? Always choosing God over family. When we think about that as a parent with adult children, does that always happen? Should that always happen? Yeah.
Just in the fact that, maybe your family's not going to invite or family members don't invite you down the side of God over what your family does.
Yeah, very good. So, and that can happen from time to time. We may have a plan for our children. It doesn't mean that plan's going to work out, right? And they may make a mistake, or they may do something wrong, or they may not choose a spouse that you would hope they choose, or they may not take the job that you would hope they would take. But if it's something that it's against God, we can't make the mistake of following them and not following God. We need to make sure that we're not excusing those kind of mistakes if they're scriptural mistakes in that way. So we have to be sure that we choose God over that, and that can be hard, right? So if you have a child that's gone astray, it can be a challenge, a real challenge to not make excuses for them. Ashley, did you post something this week about mama bears on? Well, invitation. Okay, I guess I was confused. So he was talking about mama bears, right? And so you want to give just a little recap of that? Would you mind? Now, when you think about that, so mama bears may do that, but are mama bears always right? Right. So mama bears may not always be right. So sometimes we just want to make excuses for our kids or protect our kids even when they've done wrong. And we have to be careful about that. So we want to be sure that we're choosing God over people and family. Somebody turn over to Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. Matthew 10, verse 37.
He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me.
Okay. All right. So sometimes that's hard to picture. It's hard to kind of figure out that idea that's being brought out there because we love our children more than anything else on this earth, right? And in most cases, that's the situation, but we still have to have God first, up and above our children there. And then also Joshua 24:15 is just one we quote from time to time, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And our kids are going to see that. And if we set out from an early age with the kids that, hey, we're going to serve the Lord, we're going to do these things before we do X, Y, and Z in your lives, they're going to notice that, and they'll start to see that pattern, and they'll start to see that example. As parents, we can do all these things, and we can do them 100% right, but it doesn't mean they're always going to stay faithful, but we can only do so much on our side. And, as we think about that, do your best, do your best to stay consistent in all of these things. But at the end of the day, we're going to talk about they still have to make their own decisions too, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. Number 3, it says, let them be who God called them to be. Let them be who God called them to be. And, I think about my mom whenever I was little, she wanted me to be a doctor, but she realized when she saw my kindergarten grades that probably wasn't going to happen. We may want our kids to do a certain thing. We may want them to follow after us in life in some way with a family business or maybe play a sport that we loved and we want them to do. And, they have to do what they want to do. They or what God has called them to do. They will have totally different interests than you. And they may have some things in common. But, as you start to see the generational gap kind of come along, they're going to like different things than we do and have different interests. And we can't force them into certain boxes along the way. They have to be able to kind of go their own way in that situation. But you still want to be sure that you're guiding them towards the Lord. So it's okay if they're doing different things as long as they still stay centered, on what Jesus would have them to do. Romans chapter 12, verse 6, it just talks about having them gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, let us use them. And we know that all of us have different gifts. We talk about this a lot with the church, that we have different strengths within the congregation. But this applies to us as individuals, as Christians. It applies to adult children in these ways, even teenagers. Everybody has their own gifts, their own strengths, their own abilities. And, so they should be free to be able to do those things as long as they're in accordance with God's will there. Just a question. How can parents unintentionally pressure adult children instead of trusting God's purpose? How can we unintentionally pressure adult children? Any thoughts on that? How can we pressure children at all? Give me an idea of how maybe children feel pressure, feel stress from parents.
Try to steer them into something that you want to do. Maybe their interests are not there.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so just pressuring them into something that maybe we want them to do that they have no interest in. What else? Yeah, okay. Yeah, sometimes you have the pressure there to do that, and they feel that pressure. We want them to feel the pressure from God, but not from us. As we think about, as we study, the different examples of those that were baptized throughout the Scriptures, they understood that it was important and that they were to do that. And our kids need to feel that too. But from a scriptural standpoint, if we just, are telling them every week, hey, you have to be baptized, you have to be baptized. Eventually they may do it, but it may not be helpful, right? So we want to make sure that they're making that decision, but they come to that conclusion on their own through the teaching that we give them, but then also through the scriptures that they read, while they're at services and then on their own there. So some things to consider there. What are we on number 4? Is that right? So number 4, let them make their own decisions. Kind of goes right along with that. So when we think about maturity, maturity requires responsibility when we think about that, but responsibility requires freedom. So if we're raising young adults and they start to get older, they start to become more responsible in things that requires a little bit of freedom on our part. We have to let go and let them make some of those decisions. They may make the wrong decisions in some cases. You think about back when you were a young adult, you've probably made some mistakes. I know I made one or two when I was a young adult, and as a young family, those things happen too. And I'm sure Steph and I have laughed a lot about, we think about what our parents probably thought when we made certain decisions. They were probably just shaking their heads, that happens. But it's okay to kind of shake your head to yourself, but be careful about what you relay to your kids and your young adult children when you think about that. They may be making mistakes, but it may be similar to what we did, and we kind of had to do that to grow through some things, and we may not remember those mistakes because we did grow through those, and they kind of have to do that as well. So, again, when we think about mistakes, though, I'm not talking about excusing spiritual mistakes or anything like that. I'm thinking about other things that just come up from a family standpoint and a young adult standpoint there. Somebody turn to Galatians chapter 6, verse 5. Galatians chapter 6, verse 5.
For each one shall bear his own load.
Okay, all right, so just a simple verse there that says that each of us are responsible for what we do and are bearing our own burdens. Proverbs 20, verse 24 says, a man's steps are of the Lord. How can a man understand his own way? And then when we think about kind of this topic here, or this idea of let them make their own decisions, we talked about that, of giving them freedom to be responsible. Doing that may feel risky to us. Maybe, probably the best maybe example I can think of is giving them that freedom to drive the car for the first time. They're 16 years old and they're ready to drive, and you let them pull out of the driveway. That freedom, they're excited about it, but you're nervous about it, right? So, but that can extend far from just the car. It can extend to everything in life. Eventually, God gives us the freedom to make our own decisions, and we have to, eventually kind of hand that off to our children too, so they can make the same decisions in their lives, and as they begin to start their lives and begin to start their families, and things about that too. Number 5, let them come to you for advice. What do you think about when you hear that? Let them come to you for advice. Say it one more time.
If they don't go to you, they're going to go elsewhere.
Okay, all right, so if they don't come to us, they may go elsewhere. What else with that? Kind of a different idea than that, so let them come to you for advice. What else? Okay, yeah, so just the opposite there. Let them come to you. We can't always be pushing our advice on them. It's not always welcome, right? So, as they get older and older and they're making their decisions and they have that freedom to do, kind of do what they want to do, we can offer our advice as they come to us, so, as you're kind of doing that. You think about the transition we have as parents. So as they're kids, as they're young, we're kind of commanding them, if you want to use that word, to do different things, to clean their room, brush your teeth, whatever the case may be. But that relationship starts to transition quite a bit, and you go from commanding the kids to do things, to eventually advising them in different ways. But when you're telling them to clean the room, that's different from if they're need advice on some heavier topics. And again, it's oftentimes more helpful if you kind of wait for them to come to you and ask for that help You may give them advice, but they may not listen to it. But if they come to you for advice, they may, look at that a little more carefully there. Someone turn to James 1:19 for me. James 1:19. Okay. All right. We use this verse a lot too, and a lot of times we think about it with dealing with brethren. We think about it with dealing with people at work or those of the world. But we should also think about it when we're talking about dealing with our children or even dealing with our parents when we think about us in that situation as well. So be swift to hear and slow to speak and slow to wrath there. Proverbs 27 verse 9 talks about hearty counsel. It says, ointment and perfume delight the heart, and the sweetness of a man's friend gives delight by hearty counsel. What's hearty counsel? What's that? What does that mean? Any ideas? Hearty counsel. Counsel is what? Okay, all right. So, okay, and then, but in this situation, a little different. So, counsel would be advice. So, hearty counsel or hearty advice would be, I think of it as humble advice. Giving advice in a humble way. Which is very important when we're thinking about dealing with adult children. Is being humble. Again, they have that freedom to make their own decisions now, but so we have to kind of be a little more careful about maybe how we phrase things, but it doesn't mean we sugarcoat God's word. So if we're talking about something spiritual, again, that's a little different than how maybe things get presented, but we want to, again, use humbleness when we do that, but present it from the scriptures there in the way that God would say it and would want it to be relayed to them. In Job chapter 2, we oftentimes will talk about Job's friends and that they sat for 7 days with him as he mourned, and they didn't say a word. And sometimes just being present for your children, is good. We don't always have to, be ready to throw in some advice. Again, if they're not ready for it, but just being present and ready if they do ask for it is very helpful. Number 6, warn them when they drift spiritually. Warn them when they drift spiritually. So when we think about the souls of our children, there should be nothing more concerning to us or more precious to us than that. In our prayers of always praying that they will be doing things that are right with God, that they'll stay following the Lord. So when they start to drift a little bit, we have to kind of watch for that and kind of be ready to warn in that way. If we're silent when they're in spiritual danger, it does not show love there. So, but when we think about it, though, our warnings must be gentle. They must be humble, like we mentioned. Our warnings, you can't harp on it day after day after day. We'll talk about this in just a little bit, but if we're always telling them they're wrong, they're going to stop listening to you, even if they're wrong. Eventually they're not going to listen. I think about do real estate. You guys know that I do real estate and things. It's always talked about if somebody buys a house next to train tracks, right? The first time they hear the train go by, they can't sleep, or it wakes them up, or it bothers them. But if they live by those train tracks day after day, they get used to it and they don't even notice it. But it can happen the same way with our advice to our kids. If we continually are harping on the same things, maybe they're not coming to church, and we're every time we see them, we're really harping on it. They're going to stop listening to you. So we have to do these things in a conversational way, to where we're teaching them more than just commanding them like we talked about when they were young. This kind of transitions over to that standpoint or that viewpoint of, again, it needs to be more of advice, but it's got to be done in a way that they're not going to turn off, and we may still not get the result that we hope for, and that's discouraging as parents, but it's still something that we have to, kind of be careful of and be sure that we handle it, those things in the right way. All right, so number 7, maintain God's order of priorities. Maintain God's order of priorities. So when we think about the Bible, there is a certain order to the Bible. And the same thing carries over to our families. If we can keep a certain order in our families, it's going to bring stability to our families, and it's going to bring stability to our children and then to our adult children. And hopefully that stability will transfer over to their families as they get a little older too. But our adult children are going to learn their priorities mainly from the priorities that they saw in us as we were growing up and as they see in us today. By watching what comes first in our lives and not listening to what we tell them should be first, but by them seeing what should be first in our lives there. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3 talks about that the head of every man is Christ. And we want to be sure that we're, through our example, we're relaying that idea and that mindset to our adult children. Again, starting early, like we talked about earlier, but even up until today, they need to still be able to see that we're consistent in our beliefs with that. Number 8, be a source of encouragement and not a source of pressure. Similar to what we talked about a little earlier, but the world criticizes constantly when we think about outside of these walls and outside of our family. The world is always criticizing. It doesn't matter what you see on Facebook, somebody's going to say something negative about it, right? Or anything that you see on social media. There's always going to be naysayers out there, but parents should be a place of rest, a place that your adult children can come to and not have this big source of pressure on them. It should be a little more relaxing environment to where they can rest and be free to talk to you about certain things without feeling that pressure of us pushing them in some direction that they're not ready for. But again, encouragement like that does not ignore sin, so just make sure you're not getting that mixed up with what I'm saying there. But encouragement emphasizes growth. The more we encourage, we can see our kids starting to grow in certain ways. Encouragement emphasizes growth, but also emphasizes hope and encourages that, and also progress. So we can kind of see that our children and adult children are kind of transitioning through a lot of those things, that they can do when we think about that of encouragement. So encouragement's very important. Hebrews 3:13 says, "Exhort one another daily," and we think about that again a lot as the church and with our brethren. But it's okay to exhort your family as well. Exhort your spouse, exhort your adult children. And when we talk about adult children, don't forget our in-laws too. We may have a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law. Be sure to encourage both of them as a family unit, and not just one. And things change as we bring in-laws into the family. But we all like to be encouraged, so be an encouragement to those around you, especially your family members and your children in that way. Proverbs 16:24 says, "Pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the bones." And then 1 Thessalonians 5:11, "Therefore comfort each other and edify one another." And it goes on from there. But again, encouragement keeps hearts open. If we have a positive attitude towards our children, they're most likely going to have a positive attitude towards us. And that can kind of keep some of those avenues open with different discussions that we're wanting to have with them. Yeah.
We can also pressure by guilt. Grandpa used to always say, "I won't be around next year." It's just guilty.
Yeah. Yep. Wanting you to come over and visit, and I may not be here much long. Yeah, definitely understand. Yeah, so guilt can be a big thing. All right, number 9, pray for them more than ever. This one's probably one of the most important ones of all 12 that we're looking at this morning. So pray for them more than ever. So as our control over them kind of decreases, our prayer for them should increase, right? So, we start to lose a grip on what they're doing, and they've got that freedom, but we still should be praying for them even more that they make the right decisions before the Lord there. We'll kind of jot through the next few of these pretty quickly. Number 10, care for aging parents as an example. So think about as our parents get older and the different ways that we need to care for them. you know, our kids are going to basically, you know, care for us the same way that we do for our parents. So, you know, we think about that as the scriptures tell us to honor our father and mother. You know, that honor doesn't expire when we're 50 or when we're 60. We still have to honor our parents, you know, throughout all the days of their lives. And if our children see that, most likely they're going to honor and respect us and our wishes throughout their lives as well. Number 11, develop mutual respect and friendship. Mutual respect and friendship. So, as we talked about the transition earlier of transitioning from kind of, you know, being the boss of your kids to now they're older and, you know, adult children, there's a transition there. And it's okay to kind of be their friend from that standpoint. When you're kids, it's different. You know, you can't really be their friend and still be an authority in that way. But your relationship transitions as they get older and older to where you're not really their boss anymore. When you think about that, it's hard for us to not, you know, think that we're not, but you know, they should still honor us and respect us, and we should still love them. But it's that relationship transitions a lot there, so we have to be, you know, careful about that. But keep in mind Romans chapter 12 verse 10 says, "Be kindly affectionate one to another with brotherly love, in honor, giving preference to one another." So again, things to think about with our adult children is, again, still be affectionate with them, still be loving to them, but as a brother, you know, that changes a little bit, especially if they're Christians. You know, we treat them as a brother more than, you know, than just a son or daughter at that point. And then number 12, spend time together, but allow space. Spend time together, but allow space. And I've got a lot of notes on this, but Proverbs 25:17 says, "Seldom set foot in your neighbor's house, lest he become weary of you." So when we think about this with our kids, I always think about Everybody Loves Raymond. That show cracks me up. But you've always got the in-laws coming over and doing the pop-in, and you know, that's not always the best thing to do. So if you come over a little too often, then they may get a little aggravated. If I would have done that to Russell, he'd probably be living in Lakeland now, so instead of up here. But we have to be careful about those things. You know, sometimes it's hard to let go. So when they get married, you still want to see them every day, and that's a hard transition. But but as their lives change, we have to be, you know, ready to change with it, even as difficult as that can be. So, any closing thoughts this morning before we finish up? All right. So I appreciate everybody's comments this morning. And hopefully some things to think about there. And we'll finish up now, and we'll see you guys back here tonight at 5 p.m.